start the live stream. Once you get something in your head wrong, you can't stop saying it. And then somebody around the house has been saying it wrong all week. So there's a good chance that I might say it wrong again today. But we began looking at capital punishment because of some of the recent current events we've probably had over the last 2 weeks or so, a historic number of pardons that have been issued. And many will say, well, if you don't support these pardons, then you can't be a Christian, because a Christian follows the teachings of Jesus, and all of his teachings are about forgiveness and love. But as we looked at some of the teachings, kind of a historical look back from a biblical standpoint, both the Old and the New Testament talked about capital punishment. See, you say it once wrong and you just can't stop, and then you keep hearing it repeated that way. But as we looked through there, God set up punishments in place for crime. I found an interesting quote yesterday as I was doing some reading and studying on this, and I took a picture of it, but it says, talking about justice, and justice demands that there is a punishment that fits the crime. But this quote said, when others wrong us, we cry out for justice. And boy, isn't that the truth? I want justice for that. But when we wrong God, we cry out for mercy. And there's a lot of truth in that. And it goes on talking in this quote that God is merciful and that he does offer us salvation. But there comes a time when that mercy will end, because we have refused that great sacrifice that was made for us. But under the old law, punishment was to be administered. After the flood, God set man in charge of administering and determining who was deserving of this punishment. The law was a good law. It did exactly what it was meant to do, which was to bring about Christ. Part of that was adding punishment for the lawbreaker. But then we come to the New Testament. Now, the Old Testament was both their law governing them as well as their religious law. The New Testament is only for our spiritual governing. But it also talks about punishment and setting up in place. Romans chapter 13 being one of those places that talks about the authorities being set up by God. Now, man messes it up, and we know that man has flaws, but when we really boil down to the problem, people just don't want accountability for their actions. They don't want laws stopping them from doing what they want to do. But as I said at the beginning, if we're talking about true justice, then justice demands that the punishment fits the crime. And God has set up that government in place to carry out that punishment. Now, it's not perfect. It has faults. Our systems obviously have faults. But is that a reason just to throw it all away and say, well, there's problems, it's flawed, it favors one over the other, we'll just do away with all punishment whatsoever? Well, I don't believe the scriptures would say that, even though that there are some objections to punishment. But as we looked at through the scriptures, that these objections, we cannot carry them out fully to the ultimate conclusion. If we go through these, God said, "Thou shalt not kill." Well, that was talking about murder. God has no pleasure in the death of the wicked. No, he does not. But again, justice demands punishment. God, it won't work because we don't do it correctly. Well, that's true too. Innocent people are sometimes put to death. Yes, that does happen. But there are things put in place to help prevent that in the law. So this morning, I want us to conclude this series and talk about when is lethal force, or is lethal force ever justified? Last week, one of the stories that I mentioned was happening back in, I think it was January of 2020. There was a gunman that went into a church in Texas, and all within 10 seconds this happened. He shot 2 people, and I believe killed them, but I'm not 100% sure on that. And he was stopped by an armed church member. that shot and killed him. And people were decrying that, saying that that church member did not have the right to do that, that church member was not a Christian because he took another life. Now, I guess the Christian thing to do would have been for him to just let the gunman kill everybody in that building before he stopped, because that's what would have happened, or he ran out of ammo, whichever came first. Is lethal force ever okay for a Christian to do? Now, we're not addressing Christians being in the military or Christians being a police officer. If we look at Romans chapter 13, as we did last week, I would assume that we would agree that that is the role of the civil government. There would be nothing sinful with the Christian being involved in either of those. But many people on social media, boy, we've become experts in matters of law, experts in police tactics, experts in the Middle East. I mean, we're just experts on everything when we look at social media. But what about individual Christians? Is there ever a time when it is right for me to take the life of another human being? Many would just blanket say no, never is that right. But what does the scripture say? Well, if that killing is motivated by anger, hatred, jealousy, or revenge, then the answer would be no, it's not. It is never right for someone to take a life in those moments. But that would fall under murder, wouldn't it? Because that is what thou shalt not kill. The word rendered there, kill, was more murder. We cannot do that. In Matthew chapter 15, verses 18 and 19. Matthew chapter 15 and verse 18 and 19. But those things which proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, for they defile a man. For out of the heart proceeds evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, theft, false witness, blasphemies. These things which defile a man, but to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a man. The things that we do that defile a man, murder, specifically spelled out there. But like when we look back at Lamech in Genesis chapter 6, I believe it was, he had killed someone, but that person was trying to harm him. And that told us there that that was not murder. But murder is listed as a work of the flesh in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 19. Galatians chapter 5 and beginning in verse 19. Now the works of the flesh are evident, which are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness, idolatry, sorcery, hatred, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambition, dissensions, heresies, envy, murders, drunkenness, revelries, and the like, of which I tell you beforehand, just as I told you in time past, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. All those things that are listed there are wrong and sinful, murder being one of them. And just like the murder that is motivated by my hate, anger, jealousy, wrath, revenge, then there is no way to justify killing someone with that. Because when we look earlier in our first lesson at Genesis chapter 9 and verse 6, man was to carry out the capital punishment. Why am I adding that B in there? Capital punishment for someone because God had made man in his own image. The reason a murderer deserved to die was not because his life had no value, but because the life of the victim, the innocent victim, did. And that principle carried over through the Mosaic age into the New Testament when we look at the law that justified lethal force judicially. It did, from the standpoint of the government in Exodus chapter 21. Exodus chapter 21. I can tell you what, next week's lesson will not have the word capital at all in it. Exodus 21 and in verse 14. But if a man acts with premeditation against his neighbor to kill him by treachery, you shall take him from my altar that he may die. That person willfully acts against the other, premeditated, he planned it, and that is to be punished. It's not condemning the victim for trying to prevent the attack, is it? It's the one who premeditated, who planned it. And that's the layman's way of defining what self-defense is. We are trying to stop something that someone else initiated. And in verse 14, the man did it with premeditation, didn't he? And that lethal force was justified individually. Over in chapter 22 and verse 2, Exodus chapter 22, and in verse 2, if the thief is found breaking in and he is struck so that he dies, there shall be no guilt for his bloodshed. The unspoken reason for such a provision is that the person was there. And if we're at home and someone comes into our home, we really don't know what they're there for if they come in uninvited, or what they're going to do when we confront them. And that provision is put in there because we are created in the image of God. It was their decision that put them in that situation, because the thief was there doing something that wasn't lawful in the first place. And he got struck in the head, I'm assuming, trying to put a stop to him. And he died because of that. The person that did that is in a safe condition, because their life, not saying the criminal's life didn't have value, but the criminal placed themselves in that situation because of their choice. That made the victim respond the way that they did. And the same principle is held true under the new law as well. In Romans chapter 13, in verse 4, Romans 13, and in verse 4, well, as soon as I find verse 4 here. For he is God's minister. That's talking about the government officials who are carrying out punishment. For he is God's ministers for you. God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister and avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. So the authorities... Now, again, we know that this isn't always true. Sometimes the innocent person, sometimes a falsely accused person is punished. But general statement, the government is there to administer punishment to the lawbreaker, to the one who is transgressing the law, and to do this according to laws and statutes that are in place for God's civil minister to inflict the punishment. We all know things that are crimes. There's laws. Now, again, man has messed this up and taken away much of the punishment that goes along with this. Thinking of an issue of someone that we know, a man going through a divorce, was at work and found out that his wife was driving drunk with their small children in the car. The police pulled her over, and they're not charging her with endangering their children or the public, that she's reckless driving. Now, there's a problem with that, isn't there? That's not justice, is it? She put the lives of their young children, and not only that, but the children had to watch her being arrested and going through all that with the police. But they're only going to charge her with that, a slap on the wrist for what the crime was. But these officials were set up, that's the judges, that's not the police that did that, but they were set up in place to carry out punishment for the lawbreaker. And even Paul, we looked at this last week, if he had done something worthy of it in Acts chapter 11 and verse 25, he was willing to be put to death for that. If I've done something deserving of capital punishment, then he was willing to not even try to save his life, because he was deserving of that. But what about the Christian? What about us when it comes to using force against someone? Well, Matthew chapter 25 or 26 and verse 51, Jesus talks about his kingdom and how that we're not to use it to further his kingdom. We're not going to come in and take over something by force. If we had a large number of people, maybe we go to another congregation and just take over because we're stronger and bigger than them. And we're going to force our will upon them. That's not how we further the cause of Christ. In Matthew chapter 26 and in verse 51, if that was the case, then Jesus would have never been turned over and allowed to go before Pilate, would he? In verse 51, and suddenly one of those who were with Jesus, and we read in other accounts that was Peter, stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. But Jesus said to him, "Put your sword in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword." Or do you think that I cannot pray to my Father, and he will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels? How then could the scriptures be fulfilled that it must happen thus? And that hour Jesus said to the multitudes, "You have come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to take me. I sat daily with you in the temple, and you did not seize me. But all this was done that the scriptures of the prophecy might be fulfilled." And all the disciples forsook him and fled. He could have called out angels to come down and fight that battle for him if that was the Lord's will. But that was not what his kingdom was about. It was not about having an army to defend it. When he's facing Pilate in John chapter 18 and verse 36, Jesus tells Pilate here, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here." No, it's not an earthly kingdom. So does that mean if we take those verses there, Peter being told to put his sword away, those who live by the sword are going to die by the sword. John 18 here, "My kingdom's not of this world," we're not going to fight for it like that. Is that telling us that it is wrong to protect ourselves? Well, if it is, then we've got a conflict in the scriptures, because Jesus commanded the apostles to arm themselves to protect themselves. In Luke chapter 22, and in verse 35 beginning, Luke chapter 22, and beginning in verse 35, "And he said to them, when I sent you without money bag, knapsack, and sandals, did you lack anything? And they said, nothing. Then he said to them, but now he who has a money bag, let him take it, and likewise a knapsack. And he who has no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. For I say to you that this which is written must still be accomplished in me. And he was numbered with the transgressors, for the things concerning me have an end." So they said, "Lord, look, here are 2 swords." And he said to them, "It is enough." Now, were they carrying these swords to cut their bread with or butter their bread with? No, they were carrying them for their protection. In Acts chapter 12 and verse 1, Acts chapter 12 and beginning in verse 1, "Now about that time Herod the king stretched out his hand to harass some of the church. Then he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword, and because he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to seize Peter. Now it was during the day of unleavened bread." Now they were to defend themselves on their travels and on their teachings, but not to use their sword to fight against the government or to use it to avenge someone. So what was the purpose of it? Well, to deter evil threats. They were going to be traveling. They were going to be going out to spread the gospel. There would have been some that would have harmed them and taken their lives during their journeys. Much like us, when we go on a trip today, we probably take some safety precautions as we're driving along the road. Their travels had much more dangers than we would face today. It's not like they could jump into their cars and drive from one location to the other. They had many perils in their travels, and they needed protection. Well, some will then push back if we say, okay, well, we can't commend ourselves, because Jesus tells us to turn the other cheek. And he does say that. In Matthew chapter 5, in verse 39, so does that mean that we're just to, no matter what someone does to us, well, you hit me and it felt so good on this side, let's turn to the other cheek and let you do it to that one as well. In Matthew chapter 5, and in verse 39, on the Sermon on the Mount here, and this is some difficult reading because it's going to tell us to do some things that we probably don't want or would enjoy doing in letting others, putting them ahead of us. But in Matthew chapter 5 and in verse 39, he said, "And you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you not to resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also." Now, the Lord does say this, but that was spoken concerning taking vengeance on someone. But protecting an innocent life, including your own, is that taking vengeance on them? Is that repaying them? It's not retaliation in protecting our life, is it? When that person in Texas started shooting in that church, those people that were in there worshiping, not doing anything, should they have just sat by and, well, we can't do anything to stop him, or we're not going to be turning the other cheek, so let's just keep sitting here and let him just keep shooting? Where is the logic in that? So if we take that out, if that's the case, if someone's committing a crime against us, could we even call the police against them? They're breaking into my house. I don't know what they're here for. I guess I should just leave. Let them have, or just sit and let them do whatever they want to. Where would that be? Where could we possibly justify that if turning the other cheek meant that we could not resist in any way? Because if that's what he's saying, then I can't do anything to stop anyone from doing anything to me. If we think that we're going to use turn the other cheek as a reason to not justify self-defense, then we can't resist anyone for anything at all, nor could we call the law enforcement to put a stop to anything that they're doing. Is that the kind of world that we would live in? Well, Jesus says to love your neighbor as yourself. So the person that's harming me would be my neighbor, and I can't do anything to stop them because I would have to harm them in some way. And in Matthew chapter 22 and verse 39, Matthew chapter 22 and verse 39, and he's giving the commandments here. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Exactly. We are to love our neighbor as ourselves and to care for him. So how is it love for me to sit back if I'm able to do something and allow an intruder, a criminal, to come into my house or my neighbor's home, to violate my wife, to kidnap and steal a child? That happens all the time, even in our country. How is that love if I sit back and do nothing to stop that? How am I loving them? How am I loving the innocent victim in this crime if I do nothing? Is that love? Is it love to say, well, I see that person over there harming that other person, but I'm not going to interfere because I love the one who is doing the harming? Is that really love? Well, we're told to provide for our family. In 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8. And that falls primarily on the husband, but A mother would be in a position to do that as well. But in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8, if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Now, that providing there, we sometimes, I think of that only as food or other necessities. That's part of it. Yes, I am to see to the daily needs and make sure that those daily needs are being met. We just saw a commercial as we were going out the door this morning about the number of people in this country. They call it food insecurities. They don't have a meal on their table. And one of the things, and I know this for a fact because I've been in meetings where it's been discussed, one of the things that they think about when canceling school on snowy days is how many of the kids know that that's the only meal that those kids get to eat is in school. If as a father, as a husband, it is my job to provide that, not just physical needs though. That's not where it's limited to. It includes everything. Their safety to the best of my ability for not only physical but spiritual needs as well. And that would include their safety in every lawful way. I'm to provide that for them. How could I provide for my family in that if I am unwilling to stand up and stop someone from harming them? Well, what about this? Lethal force negates my trust in God. Have we heard people say that? Well, if I am willing to kill someone, then that means I don't trust in God to take care of me. Well, if that's the case, then let's start drawing this idea down to a logical conclusion. If that's the case, then any preventative measure that I take for my safety is sinful because I don't trust God to take care of me. I would say that unless you want to get yelled at by your wife in the morning, that every one of us makes sure that the doors are locked at night in our home before we go to bed. Now, I've left them unlocked. I've left the keys in the door. I've gotten up and let the dogs out and left some doors unlocked before. And usually I get that mentioned to me in the morning when we get up. Did you realize you left the door unlocked last night? No. Dog got me up in the middle of the night. I was half asleep when I opened the door and I forgot to lock it back. I had my hands full when I came in the front door. I left my keys hanging in the outside of the door. I've done that more than once. We don't do that on purpose, do we? We lock the doors and windows. We check our homes. Because I lock my door and don't want somebody surprising me coming in uninvited, does that mean that I don't trust in God? How about things like smoke detectors? I pray at night that the Lord will watch over us while we sleep, but I have a smoke detector, and one of the things that I mentioned is fire. That at our house, and we see, especially during this time of the year with people running space heaters and fires happening. Does that mean that I don't trust in God because I have a smoke detector? Or what about when we get in our car and put our seatbelts on? Maybe some people do it just because it's the law, but it's foolish. If we look at safety statistics, to ride in a car without a seatbelt on, because the statistics show us that we are far less likely to get injured seriously in an accident if we are wearing a seatbelt, plus that dinging noise drives me crazy if we leave it off. But because I pray to God when I am in a car, well, He's going to protect me so I don't need to wear my seatbelt. If I put that seatbelt on, I'm not showing trust in God, because I've prayed that He's going to watch over me. How does that negate my trust in Him? Or we could take it even further. And many religious people try to use this as something. If I go to the doctor or take medicine for something that's wrong with me, I am showing that I don't have trust in God. Does any of that make sense? If I use this person as a physician or have this surgery or procedure or take this medicine, then I don't have trust in God. That is ridiculous to think that. Instead, we need to shift our thinking just a little bit. And we need to think, instead of thinking, if I use this, I don't trust in God, we should think, God has blessed me with these things to help me keep myself safe. And I should thank Him for the ability and access to them. God has blessed me with a home that has doors on it. I should use them to protect myself. God has blessed me with a safe car that has safety features that I hope to never even know exist. I should be thankful to Him for that. God has blessed us with doctors and caregivers that can keep us healthy and prevent things from happening to us or help us once things do happen to us. I should thank Him for that. David trusted in God when he picked up the stones to take with his sling. He prayed to God before facing Goliath. But he still used his slingshot and he still used the stones that he had selected. He didn't walk up to him empty-handed and say, God is going to protect me from you while I'm standing here doing nothing, did he? But he knew where the strength came from to throw that rock at him. In Psalms chapter 82 and verse 4, Psalms chapter 82 and in verse 4, deliver the poor and needy, free them from the hand of the wicked. How am I helping someone if I am not attempting to rescue everyone in need, including myself, from the hand of the wicked, from the one that is going to do them harm? If we're doing this, we're not going out searching for trouble, trying to find someone to pick a fight with. But if it's truly self-defense and it is escalated to the point of using deadly force to help someone, then it will not be based on hatred or anger or jealousy or revenge like we talked about earlier. We won't be doing it as a means of punishing someone because we are angry at them. We are using just enough force to stop them from harming us. There is a big difference in that. It's not to show someone else how tough we are. It's to stop them from hurting us. If we do that, then we are taking it to a sinful level. But if someone is trying to harm me and I yell stop and they stop, then that's where it should end. I don't need to break an arm or a leg to remind them not to try it again. But if we're saying stop and we can't remove ourselves from that situation, it's not an option for us, is it? Unless we're just going to sit back and allow them to harm us. We must keep using that force if we're able to stop that person from carrying out their will. Now, this is not a warm and a fuzzy lesson, but one that I hope helps us combat some of the recent current events that we've seen. People saying we can't be a Christian if we support this. Well, yes, we can, as long as it's done within the confines of the Scripture. And hopefully over the last 3 lessons that we've looked at, we can say that, yes, God approves of capital punishment. Yes, He does. He does not like it, but yes, He approves of it. And yes, He approves of us defending ourselves when we need to. We have looked at passages from both the Old and the New Testament that would support that and show that He does. God gave mankind a grave responsibility to carry out that punishment after the flood. It's not something that should be taken lightly. It's not something that should be done in happiness, just like us punishing our children. We should not be happy when we have to do that, but we do that for their own good. And it's done in our justice system for our own good. God illustrated His own justice system in Israel when He set up their government and their laws. But the established governments today are set up as His ministers. That's what Romans chapter 13 tells us. And we're to acknowledge the right and the responsibility given by God to do that, to punish the evildoers. No, we should not sit back and enjoy this when it needs to be done, but know that it's a necessity. And any civilized nation that does not abhor violence and bloodshed will not remain that way for very long. It's running rampant around not only our country, but around the world. The violence and bloodshed, it is not a good time. And our government, in many cases, is failing to administer the proper punishment that justice demands. We're reaping the harvest of that, sadly, for several generations now, and it's only getting worse. Isaiah says, woe to those in Isaiah chapter 5 and verse 20 beginning that are removing this punishment. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. Woe to men mighty at drinking wine. Woe to men valiant for mixing intoxicating drink, who justify the wicked for a bribe and take away justice from the righteous man. Woe to them. And what are they doing? They're calling things that are evil, they're calling that good. And that's happening every day. And there are crimes that the Lord has taught us demand justice be done. Not because we want to do that, but because it's required to be done. And when we don't do that, we're robbing the righteous person. We're robbing the innocent victim. And we're really, if we look at it, not helping the evildoer either. And those who fail to do their jobs are to be cursed. In Jeremiah chapter 48 and verse 10, cursed is he who does the work of the Lord deceitfully, and cursed is he who keeps back his sword from blood. He's talking about the ministers there who are supposed to be carrying out these punishments for the cause of Christ. God is the author of our life, and he has told us how best to handle it, including necessary punishments when needed. Many will refuse what the Bible says on capital punishment, because they don't want to do what the Bible says. They want to look and handpick a couple verses about Jesus and his love, and you can't possibly punish someone because of the love that Jesus showed for us. But there is a time when punishment must be carried out. If we're subject to the Lord's invitation in any way, whether it's primary obedience to the gospel or whether we are living in a way that is not right, we have let sin slip into our lives, and we're doing things that is not right in God's sight, then we have an opportunity to take care of that. Because, as Peter said, the Lord doesn't want anyone to perish. We looked at that last week, 2 Peter chapter 3. The Lord is not desiring that anyone be perished, but there's going to come a time, if we refuse that sacrifice, if we refuse to make the changes in our life once we have obeyed the gospel, there's going to come a time that we're going to have to answer for what we have done on this earth. And if you're subject to the Lord's invitation in any way, take this time to think about the condition of your soul, and if there needs to be some changes made, let's do that now while we have the opportunity as we stand and sing.